Go ahead. All right. Welcome, Curtis.
Good morning, all. For the benefit of those who might watch this on the video later and who don't know me, my name is Curtis Hamilton. I serve as secretary of the diocese and just to be a member here. And this is my third general convention as a lay deputy from West Missouri. Our other expert in the room is Christine Morrison.
I'm second in line on the expert scale.
And this is your second convention as an alternate, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So what we're going to do this morning, at least, is kind of talk through how general convention works very, very broadly. Won't get into too many weeds about parliamentary procedure and that sort of stuff, but just kind of a sense of what general convention is and kind of how it does its business. So the general convention is the governing body of the Episcopal Church. It functions as a bicameral legislature. There are two houses. The House of Deputies, which often likes to call itself the senior house, has up to 4 clergy and lay persons from each of 112 dioceses, and some other folks who have seat and voice. We'll get into that in a little bit. The House of Bishops consists of all active and resigned bishops.
Resigned or retired?
The technical term is always resigned.
Okay.
You are a resigned bishop of a diocese. You are not retired under the that's the term in the canons. That's the term of art. You technically are resigned, not retired.
So even if you are, quote, retired, you're still considered a resigned bishop?
Yes.
Because you were a bishop of a cure and now you have resigned that.
That is correct.
Someone else. Okay.
That is correct. Marty Field would be the resigned bishop of West Missouri.
Gotcha.
The general convention gathers every 3 years in normal times. We are a year delayed this year due to circumstances beyond anybody's control. The work of general convention includes adopting legislation of concern to the church, making amendments to the Book of Common Prayer, the Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church, adopting generally a triennial budget, and electing candidates to offices, boards, and other committees. So that is kind of what it does as a nutshell. And interrupt at any time.
I was going to ask about, what about an interim bishop?
Bishop Bruce is bishop provisional. She would have been a member as suffragan bishop of Los Angeles had she not come here. She will now be called in the House of the Bishop Provisional of West Missouri. That will be how she's referred to in the House of Bishops when they do their roll call.
Okay.
And she has an official.
Yeah, she's also secretary of the House of Bishops. That's a pretty becoming attraction. She is the secretary of the House of Bishops.
So she's part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last secretary of the House of Bishops was Terry White.
Huh?
I don't think I knew that. But, and at the best of times, the General Convention can be the family reunion of the Episcopal Church. That really is, it very much has that feel, at least as a part of it.
May I interrupt?
Please.
I'm guessing a part of that is at least the people I've known who have been deputies at General Convention tend to be repeat deputies. So you tend to see a lot of the same people, which is great, but in some cases you're like, you've done it for 16 conventions.
I think the last numbers I saw, and I'm going from memory here, the last couple of conventions, about 46% have been first or second time deputies. So it tends to be about half, third or more, and half first or second. And like I say, I'm working from memory on that, so don't hold me to that number. But that's about the breakdown. Some history, which will actually help you understand how General Convention works going forward. The first General Convention was held in Philadelphia in 1785. I have a note up there that the United States Constitution was written in Philadelphia in 1789. There is a reason I put that up there. Hang on to that in your heads for a minute. And note that the Constitution of the Episcopal Church was adopted at the second General Convention, also held in Philadelphia a year later. William White was the first president of the House of Deputies. The first 2 General Conventions only had a House of Deputies because we did not have bishops at the time those were held. He was later the second bishop consecrated for the Episcopal Church and was the first presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And as you know, there was no House of Bishops until 1789, which was the third General Convention. By that time, I think the House consisted of 4 bishops and they consecrated a 5th during that General Convention.
You had Seabury, you had White, you had, was Hobart one then?
Hobart, Provost. And there was, and I looked, I didn't remember the name, but you ended, by that time you had the one bishop ordained in Scotland and by the non-juring bishops there, and then at Seabury, and then the next three, the Act of Parliament was passed to allow the bishops in England to ordain bishops who didn't have to swear in allegiance to the crown. And once we had three, they quit doing that for us because we had enough bishops who were not non-jurors and were in the historic line to ordain our own bishops. So we appreciate their help, but we didn't need it after that, the third bishop
Rules.
in England. Yeah, what are you gonna do? Let's see here. So this is the structure of the General Convention. I realize that's a little small. I will kind of come up here and walk through it for those who are in the room. As I mentioned, the House is made up of two bodies. We'll talk about the process here, but the House of Deputies is elected at diocesan conventions. The House of Bishops, the diocese elect their bishops with standing committees and bishops with jurisdiction confirming those elections. So that's how you get the makeup of the two houses. Each of these bodies elects members to the Executive Council, which is the general convention between conventions. Similar to the way the vestry is the annual meeting between annual meetings, and the diocesan council is the diocesan convention between conventions. The Executive Council does the quote unquote day-to-day, they don't mean daily, but they do the work between conventions to implement policies and those sorts of things. The Executive Council consents to the election of a general officer of the General Convention. The Secretary of the House of Deputies is always also the Secretary of the General Convention as a whole. But the House of Deputies elects that person, and the bishops always have always consented to that election. So the President of the House of Deputies and the presiding bishop as the presiding officers nominate members to convention committees and to interim bodies that also do some of the carrying out of work and help provide policy information to the church. It's a little convoluted. I won't disagree with you, but
It kind of looks like Congress.
again, did you note the years I put in the first one?
Yeah.
There's a method to the madness.
Yeah.
Who
Congress came 4
took
years
off the other one?
That's the same people.
I looked that up. It's not as many as you think.
Well, there are some.
Actually, there are some, but there were not as many as you think who wrote the Constitution and then also wrote the Episcopal Constitution. There weren't. I kind of looked it up because that's something said. It's not necessarily an overlapping body. It's people who I think ran together and had discussions about these sorts of things, and then in their separate areas set it up for their own governance, is my sense.
But it is similarly created.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is absolutely.
And so we refer to the House of Bishops would be like the Senate, and the House of Deputies like the House of Earth.
Yeah, effectively, it's not quite one, it's not like 2 seats per diocese in the House of Bishops or anything, but that's roughly true. And also in size, that's a reasonable.
And you have an executive branch that does
That's-
the day-to-day work.
Right, which is effectively the presiding bishop. The presiding bishop is effectively the chief executive officer of the Episcopal Church. All right, and here is a map that shows where the Episcopal Church comes from. And it stretches from as far east as a convocation of American churches in Europe, and as from where we're at, and as far as west as Taiwan. I just put some numbers up here, just kind of give you, just to put up here, about 1.7 million active baptized members in the Episcopal Church, with an average Sunday attendance of about 460,000. There are just short of 6,700 parishes in the Episcopal Church.
6,900.
6,900, thank you. There are 100 dioceses within US states, and there are 12 overseas. The newest of those dioceses is Cuba, which was not quite readmitted because it was never actually a diocese, but Cuba was a missionary district of the Episcopal Church until the 60s. But at the last General Convention, we brought them in as a diocese of the Episcopal Church.
So if you've ever been to Paris or heard about the American Cathedral in Paris, that's a cathedral of the Episcopal Church of the United States of America.
Right. Yeah, it's the cathedral. The Convocation of American Churches in Europe is not a diocese, quote unquote, but it functions in every respect like a diocese.
Yep, with their own bishop and everything.
I will talk a little bit more about how that relates in a second, because there's some distinctions about bishops in a second
I
here.
have a question about
Please.
that. So what you're just showing is the Episcopal Church of the United States.
Yeah,
That's not the sum total of the word Episcopal across the world.
it is not. I'm sorry, let me back up here a second. No, there is such a thing as the Scottish Episcopal Church, for example, which uses the word Episcopal in its title.
But we have a lot of Episcopalians in Africa who call themselves Episcopalians and not Anglicans.
I will say I'm not aware of that.
Sudan specifically, and then there's others.
They may call themselves the Episcopal Church. I don't know that. You may be right. I'll be honest with you. I don't know.
Maybe the
that.
surprise of the convention.
You know, I know.
I don't think they're involved in, they're not part of this
No.
organization of the Episcopal Church of
No.
the United States,
But,
but
yeah, the example I know of is the Scottish Episcopal Church, which uses that as its title.
If you'll leave this up for a
Please.
second, for the purposes of the video, the different coloring of those sections would indicate provinces. And we're grouped together, just as we're grouped together as dioceses. Each diocese is a member of a larger, but smaller group called a province, who does their own work.
One other thing to note is you can almost see the map of the United States here, because almost all dioceses are within one state's geographical boundaries, but not every diocese is.
Right.
There are a few that cross state lines.
So why does Missouri get split?
Missouri was split in the late 1890s. And if you made me guess, and this is purely a guess, we were one diocese with a sea city in St. Louis. The time to get from St. Louis to Kansas City in the 1890s was
Real
long. Jackson Kemper made his way across and did his work through this part of the country. I presume they would say it was for missional strategies, however you want to define that term.
Okay.
And so basically the split is, if you draw a line straight down from north to south, that puts Boonville in West Missouri and Columbia in Missouri, except for one jut out in West Plains. And you bring me one of my favorite things. West Plains, which is right out here, is closer to three other diocesan centers than Kansas City.
Yeah.
Closer to St. Louis, it's closer to Little Rock, it's closer to Memphis. The reason West Plains got put in West Missouri is at the time of the split, there was direct rail service between West Plains and Kansas City.
Well, 1880s was a time
Oh,
of
right, sure.
explosive growth for Kansas City. And that's something that you didn't see in Nebraska or Iowa or other those places that stayed one diocese. They didn't have some other city clear across the state that was just blowing up.
And that's probably a piece of it. That's probably a piece of it as well.
Yeah.
Is there
So,
any element of the Civil War having any effect?
not really. No, not as far as formation of diocese, no, not really, because like I say, everything stayed within a state line. For the most part, a little bit of history, those churches that went to Confederacy did for a brief time create a Confederate Episcopal Church. So from that standpoint, that's the piece the Civil War had, was those that split off into a separate Episcopal, for a time at least, trying to form their own.
The General Convention, I don't think ever met during that time. So when they came back together, they had never been removed from the rolls because they hadn't officially been recognized.
I think we may have met once, and I think when they called the roll, they did,
They called them
they
anyway.
called them anyway.
Yeah.
So I could be wrong on that.
No,
but I know they never officially took those states off the rolls. So when the roll call was made, they called those states.
we like to say it didn't divide the church, but
Yeah, right.
But
what's not said is
Let's-
that
let's be honest.
there was division.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
just reading the writing on the wall, right?
Right, yeah.
Well, so to speak. All right.
Quite literally.
There you
next
go,
year.
yeah.
Yeah, I got,
I think.
So, yeah, I know. I have
All
all
right.
that. So the election of the General Convention deputation must be done at least 1 year prior to that convention starting, which means in our diocese, we had to elect in November of 2019 or 2018.
no, it's 20.
2019, it is 2019, that's right. Because this was originally scheduled for 2021, the General Convention, so we have to elect about 18 months out. But you have to do it at least a year before. And it's just a vote by the Dawson Convention. In West Missouri, if there's a vacancy that comes up, it's filled by the ecclesiastical authority, which is a Dawson bishop if there be such. In our case right now, our provisional bishop fills that role. Had neither of those existed, the standing committee would have filled those positions. And that each diocese does that differently. That's how West Missouri does it, is that the bishop is able to appoint. We generally send, at Dawson expense, 4 deputies and the first alternate in each order. I don't know how standard that is across the church. That is simply what we have done for time immemorial.
Texas sends all theirs.
So,
Yeah, the 4 deputies, for sure.
yeah.
In every diocese,
diocese.
but every diocese is different on the alternate.
And there's good reason, and when we talk about the schedule, there's good reason to send at least 1 alternate
Yeah.
when we talk about the schedule here in a second. But this year, because of the pandemic, the presiding officers of the 2 houses have asked the diocese send no more than their deputies and the first alternate. And they have asked bishops who are inactive, resigned, whatever, not to attend. The reason why they made all these changes, I'll just put this out there. The president of the House of Deputies was able to consult with a former Army officer who was in charge of the U.S. Army's response in Europe to COVID. His information to her was that best case scenario, everybody vaccinated, everybody wears a mask, social distancing, no singing at worship events. Best case scenario, 1 in 10 people attending the convention would contract COVID. Best case scenario. Hence we will talk about kind of the shortening of things coming up. So.
Is vaccination required?
Yes, they are requiring vaccination. You will have to be masked unless you are speaking. No eating on the floor. You may have something to drink, but no eating on the floor where the mask will be off an extended
You
period.
can't sit on the floor and eat.
No, you cannot.
The masks that show up will be interesting, I'm sure.
Well, they're actually calling for K95, KN95s or better, and we'll be providing those. Plus, we will have to daily do a PCR test. No, I'm sorry, not
No,
PCR
quick,
test. The
rapid,
quick test
the rapid.
in our hotel room every morning, and they'll be providing us with tests, so. And they are making plans if somebody does contract COVID, how to deal with that. So all of this is actually going to be finalized. Let's see, what is today? Monday, tomorrow and Tuesday this week is the final determination of what lengths are going to be, but it's a pretty safe bet. What I'm saying here is what's going to be lengths and those sorts of things. It's a very safe bet. The presiding officer will make a recommendation to the executive council who has to approve it, but I think that's a foregone conclusion at this point. This is our deputation this year. This is a clergy deputation. Some folks here know Father Larry Aaron, who's now at St. Mary Magdalene in Belton.
Yeah.
And then this is the lay deputation. And while we have not taken Channing off the list, he's not going, which is why Christine is. I will make one note. I just turned 49 in April. I am the oldest member of our deputation, our first 4, by approximately 15 years, give or take, maybe 13. Amanda's, I think, about 12 years younger than I am, and Spencer and Alexandra are younger still. That does make us a bit of a unicorn within the Episcopal Church.
That's great.
Yeah.
So,
To be a unicorn in that you're younger than most people.
younger than most. I think I may be right at the median age of deputies at the convention.
Yeah.
I'm close anyway. I may be a little younger than that number, but I'm right in that ballpark.
But all of them have general convention experience.
Right.
Mhm.
And all of these folks have leadership within the diocese experience as well. So it's not really a surprise that these folks were elected.
I'm going to be the oldest, and I turned 50 last year.
Right, oldest of us going. This is the general convention schedule before COVID. And I'm gonna walk you through a day. This timeline runs from 7 a.m. in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. That's the time scale on the left. Legislative committee hearings often start as early as 7:30. We'll talk about the committees here in a minute. Workshop and then legislative sessions, and then you often have legislative committee hearings that aren't on here, but they will meet at night often. They may have hearings up here, but here they'll work on amending legislation, that sort of stuff. So you can easily be going from 7 in the morning to 10 at night without batting an eye. It is not at all unusual. And you're doing that for 8 legislative days. But committees normally start meeting 2 days before the convention. That's so that's, you can hear, I was going to have to be there sometime that day. Not everybody in the deputation did. I do have a committee assignment and would be there from Tuesday the 5th through Thursday the 14th.
But there was so much action happening in committee meetings and get-togethers and everything else. If you had a fear of missing out, it was constant the entire time.
So that's your typical day. The actual convention this year is going to be in this block in the big black box. It's actually going to be 4 days. Committees will not be meeting during the convention. All the committee work will be done beforehand. I'll have something on that here in just a second. But the legislative session will be 4 days. So nobody will be arriving any earlier than Wednesday the 6th. They're going to be leaving. Wait a minute, that's off a day. I'm sorry. It's Friday through Monday. That's off a day. My apologies. But everybody then will be leaving Tuesday the 12th. And in a normal general convention, as Christine was mentioning, the Episcopal Church women have their triennial meeting. I have not heard for sure whether they're still meeting or not. I don't think that's been decided. They have asked organizations that might normally hold meetings not to hold them at the convention to reduce the number of people coming, but I don't know what ECW has chosen to do. There's also normally an exhibit hall where seminaries, publishers, various sundry organizations that do work within the church, you have a chance to meet and greet people, and you have a chance to find out what they do.
Clergy apparel companies, all that.
Exactly.
Swag bags of all types and shapes.
Yes. Normally our deputation would have a dinner together because we don't always get a chance to see each other except sitting down at the legislative sessions. So it's a chance to be together. I don't know that we're going to do that in this case. They're kind of asking folks not to gather in groups in restaurants during this. So seminary dinners and then meetings of affinity / interest groups, deputies of color, seminaries will get together and have discussions. That sort of group, those sorts of groups also.
The deans will usually have a dinner.
Right, if they're there, yeah.
If they're there, any deans that are there,
So.
but not him.
So my guess, I say, we don't know for sure what the legislative day is going to look like, but my guess is we're going to be in legislative session, 2 sessions a day, probably for the 4 days. Would be my guess, since there's no committee meetings or other such things.
How many deans are there in the country? Is there one per bishop or?
Well, the head of a cathedral is a dean.
Right.
And presumably every diocese has a cathedral. Some dioceses do not have cathedrals, so I guess they effectively wouldn't have a dean in that sense.
Okay.
But then when we talk about the deans conference, those are the deans we're talking about, are deans of cathedrals specifically. There are also deans of seminaries. There are also deans of deaneries, which are smaller geographic areas within a diocese, but they're not counted in the dean's conference. That's just cathedral deans. So effectively, there could be 112, but there may not be.
Convention organization, and this is the biggest piece for me. It reflects the Episcopal Church's belief that under God, the church is ordered and governed by its people, laity, deacons, priests, and bishops. Those folks in the collar and the ones that wear the purple shirt with the collar, they don't have all the say in the church. And at least in the Episcopal Church. So, and that is absolutely organizational, that is absolutely fundamental to how the Episcopal Church works. So that's why you have what we have. The House of Deputies, as noted earlier, is elected from each diocese. Navajo land and the Congregational Church in Europe are not technically dioceses, but for all intents and purposes, they function as dioceses. The Episcopal Church in Liberia has seat and voice, but they do not have a vote. And the arcane reasons why that I don't honestly know. There is also an official youth presence of up to 2 persons from between 16 and 21 maybe. Anyway, but 2 per diocese who have seat and voice, but they do not have a vote. That's up to 18 additional members with seat and voice in the convention. Again, deputies have up to 4 clergy and 4 lay persons. Don't have to send that many, but that's the maximum you're allotted. The presiding officer of the House of Deputies is currently the Reverend Glade Clark Jennings. However, her term expires at the end of this convention, so we will be having an election. The current vice president of the House of Deputies is the Honorable Brian Rushing. Gay Jennings is from one of the Ohio dioceses, but I don't remember which one. Mr. Rushing is from Massachusetts, I believe. And again, his term ends as well at this convention. The president and vice president of the House of Deputies must be from different orders because the House of Deputies, remember, is clergy and lay persons. So 1 priest, 1 lay person. We always hold the House of Deputies president election first because whichever order is elected there, vice president has to be elected from the other order.
What's the honorable title for?
He is a member of the legislature from his state.
Oh, okay.
And the clergy order, is deacons as well, so
Right.
it could be a deacon.
It could theoretically be a deacon, yes. But they have to be from separate orders, so we always elect the House of Deputies president first. So. And then in the House of Bishops, again, this is the long language that says basically every bishop currently active or resigned is eligible to have seat, voice, and vote in the House of Bishops. Their quorum doesn't include every bishop, of which there are over 300, when you include everybody. So their quorum factors in only currently active bishops plus the number of resigned who are there at the time. So they don't have to get 150 there to have a quorum. The current presiding officer is the presiding bishop, who is obviously Bishop Michael Curry. It's a 9-year term for all of these officers, for both House of Deputies and House of Bishops, the presiding bishop. So the presiding bishop is elected by the House of Bishops, and then that election is concurred with by the House of Deputies. So the House of Deputies has some say in who the presiding bishop is, but it's not a direct vote for the presiding bishop.
So Curry's term ends 90 days after July's.
The way
The next gentleman.
the way it's currently next general convention, yeah, the House of Bishops will be electing a presiding bishop in Louisville in 2024.
And it's 2024 because that's when it was originally scheduled to be,
Yes.
even though that's just 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they did, yeah. And right now, it's set up that it's technically 90 days out. It's the way the canons are written. Effectively, November 1st of the year of the election is when the turnover occurs. Roughly, that's when the bishop is seated in their cathedra, the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. One of the pieces of legislation is to change the canons to make it more clear how this works, because bishops are required to resign at 72. So the age of the presiding bishop when they are elected actually technically determines how long they can be. They can 3, 6, or 9 years, depending on how old they are, and when they turn 72. Because all bishops are required to resign at 72, as are all clergy. All clergy are required to resign at 72. So that's the why.
Doesn't mean they stop working.
No, it does not. No, it does not. I know several priests in this diocese for whom that is the true state. Prior to 1976, they rotated I'm sorry, 1926, thank you. They rotated who was presiding bishop based on geography. It was this diocese, then it became this diocese, and it became this diocese, and they rotated back. After 1975, though, they changed it to a seniority based on consecration date. And then in 1926, it became election by the House of Bishops. Since 1938, the presiding bishop has to resign their current jurisdiction when they become presiding bishop. But in order to have a jurisdiction, and bishops with jurisdiction, that's important for who consents to elections of other bishops. The presiding bishop is technically the diocesan bishop of the Convocation of Churches in Europe and the Episcopal Church in Micronesia. However, as Andy indicated earlier, there's a suffragan bishop who is elected by the Convocation of Churches in Europe, and that person is effectively the day-to-day bishop for that diocese. It's a quirk within the system. And then for Micronesia, generally another bishop in the church, it's been Hawaii or it's been the bishop of the armed forces, ends up with some day-to-day control in Micronesia.
So when the presiding bishop is elected, does he move to Washington DC?
New York, the Episcopal Church's general offices are in New York, but the bishop's seat is in the National Cathedral in Washington,
I
DC.
see.
The actual chair is in Washington, DC.
There was talk once upon a time to move either the offices to Washington or move the cathedral to
A little
New
more
York.
than talk, there was almost direct requests by the General Convention that 815 be sold, and
Right. Didn't happen.
it didn't happen for whatever reasons. Anyway,
8:15.
815 Second Street is the address of the offices of the Episcopal Church. So it's called 815,
In New York.
New
New
York,
York.
815 Second Street, New York, New York. So it gets called 815. All right, so there are 4 sources of resolutions. I'm sorry, I went with the funny. It was just my age group.
We're gonna sing it the rest of the day.
So
I'm just a bill.
had to go with the funny one, sorry. The interim bodies we talked about that were task forces and such can submit resolutions to the General Convention. Those are called A resolutions. Bishops can propose resolutions. Makes sense, there are B resolutions. Takes 3 bishops from 3 different dioceses, and the reason that's important is some dioceses can have a diocesan bishop, they might have a coadjutor, a bishop coadjutor, and up to 2 suffragan bishops, and who knows how many assistant bishops in their diocese. So you can have one diocese and all their bishops come together and make a resolution. That's not necessarily representative of the church as a whole. Hence the requirement that for bishops, you have 3 bishops, 3 different dioceses have to propose a resolution. Provinces or dioceses can submit resolutions. Our diocesan convention can vote to have a resolution be submitted to the General Convention. We've done that at least once in the time I've served as secretary of the diocese. And then deputies, and I can't spell for anything apparently.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. It's 3 deputies. It's not required in the House of Deputies they'd be from different dioceses. I frankly find that interesting, but it's not required. And again, no more than 3 resolutions from any particular deputy.
I think that's why there's so many resolutions.
Yeah.
From the
Yeah.
D, from the D mode.
And then there's something called memorials where you can bring an issue of interest up and send that to the General Convention for it to do some work on. Often it's tied to a resolution that's already been presented or can be. And the last time I looked was May 25th and I started typing up this presentation. There are 243 resolutions submitted. Normally you have until the 3rd legislative day to submit a resolution. For this convention, you have until tomorrow. They're effectively saying after tomorrow, you can't submit another resolution.
But truthfully speaking, though, most of your serious resolutions or bigger topics have already been submitted.
Right.
I can't imagine the ones that would be submitted that late would be earth-shattering type resolutions.
Not often they can be. Most of the resolutions are A resolutions, quite frankly, for the work of 3 years, the executive council, those interim bodies are the ones that submit a lot of the resolutions. That's the source of most of them.
Is the convention required to get through 243 before the? end of
Yes,
full
yes,
day?
we are. Yeah, we are in one way or another. We'll talk about that here in just a second. These are the committees of General Convention. The one I am serving on is committees and commissions. Yes, I'm on the committee on committees. It exists and I'm on it. God help me. So.
It's a lot.
This is how legislation goes through
It's different.
general convention. I'll walk through it fairly quickly because you'll be used to it as you talk about with Congress. The blue is the easiest part. Resolutions are submitted to the legislative committees, who then move them out to a house of initial action, either one of the two houses, depending on what the resolution is about. Theology resolutions, for example, go to bishops first. But each committee has an original house of jurisdiction and it's just as assigned. The original house can either adopt with, it can adopt, it can amend, it can substitute, but it adopts the resolution in some way or form, or it can reject it. If it rejects it, it's done. After the house of initial action adopts in some form, it goes to the other house for its work. If they agree to it, they have concurred and it becomes an act of the general convention. That action that's being done can also be to refer it to an interim body between conventions. So those are two things that can happen for a piece of a resolution to survive further. Either it survives as an act of convention or it is referred and may come back at a later convention. If the second house adopts with some sort of amendment, has to go back to the first house's legislative committee for a recommendation on the amendments. It then comes back to the house of initial action, which can either reject it at that time again, they can concur with it. And so as long as it's passed the same language in both houses, at some point in time, it becomes an act of convention. If this one adopts with some sort of amendment, it goes back to the second house, and you can rinse and repeat for days. If there's really disagreement at some point in time, either the legislative committee will come together and try to come up with something, or effectively similar to in Congress, a committee will be formed and try to come to some sort of agreement. So, a little more on the legislative process.
Good.
I'm sorry, yeah.
That's a lot of work. The house of, are these two houses, are these paid positions?
The house, no, the house, the presiding bishop is, yes, but then the presiding bishop is also the CEO of the Episcopal
Delegates to
Church.
the houses are.
The House of Deputies until 4 years ago now, the president of the House of Deputies was strictly volunteer, no remuneration. As of the last general convention, the president of the House of Deputies now, because they serve as vice president of the executive council, gets a director's fee. It is not a salary. They are not an employee of the Episcopal Church, but they get a director's fee
For being in that position.
for being in that position. I had thoughts, my side didn't win the day. What are you gonna do?
You could turn in a resolution. That'd make it 200.
I tried. I tried on the floor a couple different
He was on the
times.
floor,
And
he
it
was
didn't
not.
happen. That's okay.
It's like, what the heck?
It's what it is. It's all right. Normally convention don't meet until 2 days before the convention starts by the rules of order. At this convention, it's being waived. We've been meeting via Zoom, and we'll have to have a vote to make those legislative committee actions legitimate, because they actually do technically violate the rules of order. But pandemics do things to people.
Can any resolution die in committee?
No. It has to be reported out to the House. It can be reported, a report out can be that the committee be discharged from any further consideration of a resolution. That often happens if you have 5 resolutions on the same topic. They'll pull them together into one resolution. That's the one that goes to the floor for a vote of some type. The other 4 will be, the committee will be discharged from any further action on those resolutions.
But the committee can say, it is not our recommendation that this resolution be upheld or whatever.
Yes, yeah, it's the
But
same
the
as
House has
that's
to take action
mentioned,
on
that it can recommend adoption, can recommend not to adopt, can recommend, you can come out of the committee with amendments.
Right.
All those parliamentary things are absolutely viable.
Okay, all right.
For the most part, the committees of the 2 houses that have the same name deliberate together and hear testimony together, but they have to vote separately whether to recommend adoption or not. This does allow legislation to move more quickly. If both committees agree to it and it goes to the first house and there's no amendment, it doesn't have to go back to the committee. It just goes straight to the second house for their action based upon that house's committee's recommendation. You have to have a hearing on all resolutions. It is required that there be a hearing on all resolutions. Now, normally, again, if you have the 5 that are one, they'll have one hearing on that topic, and that will be considered a hearing on all 5 of those resolutions.
Are those hearings early on or?
2 days before the convention, at 7:30 in the morning,
Okay.
7 o'clock at night, all the time.
That's where the FOMO comes in.
Yeah. There is a consent calendar in each house. Each house treats it differently, but effectively what happens is if something goes on the consent calendar, you may have 30 resolutions that the house votes on at one time. And if you say yes, all 30 of those are deemed adopted by that house to move on to whatever the next step is.
I love consent.
The House of Deputies has a liberal use of it. Everything that comes out of committee is presumed to go on the consent calendar unless the committee or a member of the House has to pull it off. And the House of Bishops, it only goes on the consent calendar if the committee puts it on the consent calendar and it can still come off. But that has to do with the fact that the House of Deputies is 800 plus people and the House of Bishops is generally around 200 who are actually there at the time of convention, give or take.
Is the adoption of resolutions a simple majority or?
Come to that here in a second, but the general answer is yes, but I'm going to come to that in a second.
Yes, but
Yeah.
Yes, but.
And yes, yeah, that yes, but is the best thing. Resolutions not passed at adjournment are lost. If you don't get it passed by the time convention ends, which is 6 o'clock on the last day, it's no longer there. Because of the pandemic at this one, I think there's going to be a move to suspend the rules of order and say anything that's not dealt with at this convention will automatically roll to the 81st. We've got 4 days. We're not going to get to everything, but they don't want things to die. So there'll have to be a special rule of order passed to do that. But I imagine it's going to happen.
When our resolutions are taken as they come in, is there some order?
There is an order.
Come first served.
Frankly, that is up to the Committee on Dispatch of Business with the possibility, frankly, the presiding officer having a thumb in that weighing the scale of that discussion, which is the same as is true here to a certain.
Right.
What's important?
That's a piece of that's just a general piece of parliamentary procedure. On most votes in both houses, actually, but I'm going to talk specifically about House of Deputies because in the House of Bishops, it's always one person, one vote. But in general, on most issues with House of Deputies, it's one person, one vote. We vote as one body, majority. Again, most votes need a simple majority to pass, but there are certain things that require a 2/3 majority to pass. Though that's designated by the canons or by the rules of order of the House of Deputies. There is, however, a provision for a requirement of vote by order. And this gets a little tricky. I'll try to do the Reader's Digest version, but in a vote by orders, which some things are required to be a vote by orders, some things you simply need 3 deputies from these different dioceses to say, I want to vote by orders on this issue. And you have to do it. So that means each diocese gets one vote. Effectively, you end up splitting the House of Deputies into a House of Laity and a House of Clergy, in which each diocese gets one vote. You poll the deputation, and if a majority of the deputation agrees, then the vote is yes. If a majority does not agree, the vote is no. A 2-2 vote, a divided vote, is effectively a no vote.
Like a caucus. It's like a
Effectively, the diocese caucuses, and actually there's a form you fill out with the names of the deputation, you mark whether they voted yes or no.
Yeah.
And then a majority or 2/3 of the diocese in each order have to say yes for it to pass, or in some cases 2/3. So this is often used this can be used as a way to stop something from going through because it's a harder threshold to pass than it is just a simple majority of the House. It's a little harder to get. This can slow things down a little bit and maybe make it to where it's less likely for something to go through. But there are, again, some things. Second readings of amendments to the Constitution of the convention require a vote by orders. So that's,
And when you say one person, one vote, it's made very clear that and I don't know if this takes place in other legislative bodies, that you have to vote the mind of the chair of the body or whatever, but in this case, you don't have to do that. You vote your own conscience. But effectively, you do that within each deputation, and then the majority of that becomes the vote for the Diocese of West Missouri is yes or no, based on what you did internally.
and that's an important distinction. We are not delegates to a convention,
Right.
which is what is in West Missouri. A delegate, you theoretically can direct their vote. I'm not saying that it would happen. I can imagine the vestry saying to the delegation, this is what we expect you to do on this piece of legislation coming for the diocesan convention. We are deputies from this diocese to the general convention. A deputy is generally considered not to be able to be directed how to vote.
Right.
It is an expectation that they will vote their own mind. Hopefully an informed vote if all goes well, but nevertheless, there is not a provision that says the Diocese of West Missouri can tell me as a deputy how I have to vote.
Do they know how you vote?
Generally, no. Votes are done by electronic device. It is theoretically possible to get that information. On a vote by orders, so a member of the deputation can call for the yeses and nos of the individual members to be recorded in the journal. So yes, in some cases, yes. In general, no more so than you necessarily know. If you're voting on your phone in our convention, you wouldn't necessarily know how your neighbor voted. We use red and green cards, so yeah, it's a little more public than it is here.
We're going to the phone thing this time. Right?
We are going to the phone thing for ballots. I don't know that we will for just yes or no votes and resolutions. That's.
Sometimes though, what's interesting with the voting by orders, and I can't speak to general convention because I haven't done it, but in the diocesan convention, especially if there's something contentious, someone will request that the vote be by orders because they want to literally see who's voting yes and who's voting no.
Because we then have to have people stand up and count each order.
Doesn't that make it harder to pass though, to request vote by orders?
Only because you then have to have separate votes. They have to be,
Right.
they have to be in affirmative. The best answer, other than voting for standing committee, which is always by orders. And I can remember 20 years ago we used to hold our diocesan convention on a Saturday to a Sunday. It got moved to a Friday, Saturday. There was a move to move it back to a Saturday, Sunday. Can you imagine there were members of the clergy who wanted to vote by orders on that particular resolution?
No.
Who maybe didn't want to have a diocesan convention on a Sunday? The vote passed in the lay order. It didn't pass in the clergy order. The resolution was not adopted. So, it's not like that here because it's a little, unlike in the diocesan convention where you have effectively have the two houses, it's still a majority vote. The math gets wonky here as to what the threshold is. Generally, I would say, based on some math I've done, on a vote by orders, you need about 60% of the laity and 60% of the clergy to say yes for it to end up passing on a majority vote by orders. Roughly, it can be smaller, but the sweet spot is if about 60% of the laity and 60% of the clergy are for something, it's going to pass whether it's a vote by orders or not.
Yeah.
Anything less than that, it can get dicey.
You get to electoral college situations where.
That's exactly what you get in.
Well, if every single diocese was split right down the middle, then they're all no votes.
Yeah, but that would,
Even if 50% of the people approve of the wishes.
the math says it's theoretically possible to do a vote by order and have it pass with less than a majority of the laity of the clergy. It's mathematically possible. It's not likely, but it is mathematically possible. I ran the math and it's something like 43% of the lay order could pass something on a vote by orders in a very specific set of votes.
Yeah.
Not likely, but.
Yeah.
And I have here a list of resources for general convention. I'm going to get this to you, maybe go up on the webpage
Sure.
and we'll get something out.
Send it to Melissa. Sure.
Yep, I'll do that. The general convention webpage is available and it's a good resource. The blue book is all the reports, all these agencies I talked about that come through. When it's printed, once upon a time, they usually give you a three reading binder and it ended up being like this. It's now, you can get it printed, but it's now done as a PDF. So is it electronically published now? The virtual binder is where they usually give you a 3-ring notebook where you have to keep track of legislation. They pass out changes. They give you this big binder that you carry around. And now gone virtual, we get an iPad.
Oh, and the best part of the virtual binder is when you brought your iPad up, they go, okay, we're looking at this
Right.
resolution. It would show up on your screen.
But you can
And you just
access
search for
it,
it.
yeah, but you can access it on the internet. It's a little slower on the internet version than the one we have. But as we're going through convention, if you wanted to follow what we were doing, you could go there and do it. It's accessible to the public. Sources of news, the two good ones I suggest are Episcopal News Service and the House of Deputies News. Those are good sources for news-related information coming out of the convention. There are other sources. I'm not going to suggest that any news source is unbiased in this day and age, but these are the two least biased, in my opinion.
Right.
There are others that come from both the left and the right that are a little more biased, but we'll give you information. In prior years, each house's deliberation was available online, streamed. I presume that's going to be the case again this year. Probably the best place to get a hold of those is off the General Convention's webpage. If you want to sit back and you have nothing to do on a Saturday morning, watch us deliberate. You can do that.
Having trouble sleeping.
We're not deliberating that late, but if you need an afternoon nap, I got you.
I don't know,
Like-
sometimes it gets pretty. full.
C-SPAN for the church,
For the late reading, for the late night reading, let me refer you to the Blue Book.
right?
Let's be
I can
honest.
just pull up and watch it after the fact and having trouble sleeping.
I'm not sure if that was as true as it used to be. I don't know if you can get,
Oh, you
if they record them for playback later or not. I actually went and looked, I couldn't find on YouTube the prior year's conventions stuff.
Surely the footage is somewhere. It's just whether they're
I'm not sure about that, but those are,
Yeah, why wouldn't I?
right.
so that's the nuts and bolts of how convention itself works. I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to get into some topics that have been maybe contingent in the past and continue to be contingent, I'm contingent in the right word, but have come up several years. There's one that's hit really recently that I'm sure we'll have a discussion about.
We're gonna look at specific resolutions. At least in my mind, the hot topic one right now, and this isn't the first time it's come up at General Convention. It's changing the canons of the church to allow for what we call open communion, which removes the requirement of baptism in order to receive.
Yeah, and to call communion without baptism, because open communion has a slightly different
Right, yeah,
context.
communion
I
without
read about
baptism.
that, yeah. Well, open communion has more to do, it's cross denomination.
It does,
Right.
that's exactly
There's
right.
open
But we can get into those finer points.
Right, so we'll talk about that.
And,
So,
and,
So that's gonna be brought up again this year.
oh yeah,
Yes.
there is the Diocese of Northern California put forward what is now a C resolution to change the canons to permit communion of the unbaptized. So right now, we'll get into this more, but specifically right now, you are not to give communion to somebody who's not baptized.
And is that a diocese vote?
That
Or
is
one person?
a national church canon. So it is,
Oh, okay.
That
it is
we're all-
theoretically incumbent on these two, it's theoretically incumbent on these two gentlemen to make sure everybody who comes up for communion has actually been baptized before they get communion.
and the practice, the general practice of the church is nobody really pays attention to it. I mean, we all say it.
Yeah.
We say that's the requirement, but we don't know if you're baptized or not. If you come up, we're not
So
checking
we have a
your
little
card.
Yeah.
But if we know that you're not baptized, we'll generally have a conversation with them
Yeah.
to say, technically, you're not allowed to receive, but let's talk about baptism, right?
I
That's
have
where the
a,
canon stands in the moment.
I have a priest friend who, when this came up, vehemently put something on Facebook. I'm talking to her tomorrow just to hear her side of the story. So
So,
just because you can't tell me how to vote doesn't mean I shouldn't listen to people and try to come to an informed opinion.
so on that note, a document just came out, a statement this past week signed by 22, I don't know if you want to call them
Effectively seminary deans, theologians
of the church, basically seminary people, deans, past deans, professors, et cetera. Wanting to uphold the requirement that baptism is necessary for communion and reasons. And now there's a counter note from the group that's against it. They're like, we're not trying to create controversy. but blah, 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 blah. And, in different parts of the world or of the country, it may present itself differently, how, there may be more of the unbaptized coming, and so you want to treat it in a way that the church doesn't allow you to treat it, but in other places that may not be an issue. So, when it's come up before in convention, and we'll talk about this more next week, it has typically passed the House of Deputies to change the canon. It has never passed the House of Bishops,
That's true.
who are going to be more the guardians of the theology of it, right? And there's some committee who's written, I'm sure, thousands of pages on why, with scriptural reference, blah, 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 blah. I know, we gotta go. Thank you.